The storm had raged for days, turning the vast wilderness into an endless sea of white. The once mighty trees standing tall for centuries now bowed under the crushing weight of ice, their branches brittle and lifeless. The wind carried a cruel melody, its sharp howling whispers slicing through the frozen expanse like the cries of forgotten souls. Snowflakes fell relentlessly, layer upon layer, erasing all traces of life, burying the earth in a cold, merciless embrace. In this endless stretch of frost and silence, survival was not a battle, it was a curse, and yet in the heart of this frozen graveyard a lone figure moved. A wolf, not with the steady grace of a hunter nor the confident stride of a predator, but with the struggling steps of a creature on the edge of its strength. His thick fur, once a shield against the cold, was now stiff with ice, clinging to his gaunt frame like a prison. His breath came in ragged puffs, vanishing instantly into the frigid air. His golden eyes, once fierce, proud, unshaken, now flickered with something dangerously close to defeat. Hunger gnawed at his insides, an unbearable emptiness growing with each passing hour. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin, a silent testament to the days he had gone without a kill. He was alone, he had not always been. Once there had been a pack, strong, fast, unbreakable. They had hunted together, run together, howled under the vast moonlit sky as one, but the storm had come like a ruthless beast, tearing through the land without mercy, separating them in the blinding white chaos. He had searched, he had called out into the night, his voice lost in the deafening winds, but no answer had come, and so he wandered each day, bringing him closer to the line between life and death. His instincts told him to keep moving, to keep fighting, but how much longer could he fight against an enemy he could not see? Then a scent, faint, almost lost in the cold, but it was there. Something different from the lifeless frozen air he had been breathing for days. It carried warmth, smoke, wood, fireman. His muscles tensed at the realization the scent of humans had always meant danger, a warning passed down from generations of survival, but now it meant something else. It meant warmth, it meant food, it meant a chance, a final desperate chance. His hesitation was brief, his body making the choice before his mind could protest. Slowly, painfully, he turned toward the source of the scent, his legs dragging through the snow, his body swaying with exhaustion. The cabin was far, barely visible through the swirling white, but it was there, a fragile hope in an unforgiving world. And so, with nothing left to lose, the wolf began his final journey toward the light in the storm. Inside the cabin, a man sat alone, staring into the flickering fire, its golden flames casting restless shadows on the wooden walls. The storm had trapped him here for days, sealing him off from the rest of the world like a prisoner in an icy tomb. Outside, the blizzard howled like a living thing, relentless and unforgiving, but inside, there was only silence, the kind of silence that seeps into a man's bones, making him feel smaller against the vast emptiness beyond these walls. He was used to solitude. He had chosen this life, away from the noise of the cities, away from the expectations of others. Here, in the heart of the frozen wilderness, he had learned to live with only the company of his own thoughts. But on this night, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension he couldn't quite name. Then, he heard it. At first, it was so faint that he thought it was just the wind, another trick of the storm. But then it came again. A sound so subtle, so out of place, that it made him sit up straighter. Scratching, not the wild, desperate clawing of an animal trying to get in, nor the sharp skittering of a rodent seeking warmth. This was slow, weak, hesitant, like something that had barely enough strength left to try. The man's breath stilled, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. He had lived here long enough to know that wolves did not come to doors. They did not seek shelter from men. And yet, something was there. For a long moment, he did nothing, his mind caught between logic and instinct. Logic told him to ignore it. The storm would take care of whatever was out there. But instinct told him to move. Something about the sound, the fragile, pleading nature of it, pulled at something buried deep inside him. Slowly, cautiously, he rose from his chair, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, not out of fear, but out of habit. Then, with steady hands, he unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open. The wind rushed in immediately, biting against his skin like frozen knives. Snow swirled around him, making it hard to see. But then, through the storm, he saw it. A shape hunched low to the ground, trembling, barely standing. A wolf. Its fur was stiff with ice, its breath heavy and labored. But it wasn't the sight of the wolf that made the man's heart tighten, it was its eyes. There was no rage in them, no wild, untamed fury. Just exhaustion, pain, And something else. Something the man never expected to see in the eyes of a beast. A plea. For what felt like an eternity, the man and the wolf simply stared at each other, two beings from different worlds, bound by an unspoken moment. The man's breath was shallow, his fingers still curled around the edge of the door. His instincts screamed at him to be careful, to step back, to shut the door, to let nature take its course. A wolf was a predator, a creature of the wild, untamed and dangerous. It did not belong inside a human's home, and he did not belong in its world. But as he looked into the wolf's golden eyes, he saw something that silenced every warning in his mind. It wasn't anger or aggression that shone back at him. It wasn't the raw, primal hunger of a beast searching for its next kill. It was something far more fragile. It was surrender. The wolf swayed slightly, its body barely holding itself upright. Its breath came in uneven, pained gasps, every rise and fall of its chest a battle against the exhaustion threatening to consume it. The storm had taken everything from it. Its strength, its pack, its will to keep moving. It had fought, it had run, it had hunted, but now, at the end of it all, it had come to the one place it never should have. Not out of strategy, not out of instinct, but out of something far more desperate. Hope. The man didn't know what made him do it. Maybe it was the loneliness that had lived inside him for too long. Maybe it was the weight of the silence that pressed against his chest night after night. Or maybe, deep down, he recognized something in the wolf, something he himself had felt in the darkest moments of his life. The feeling of being lost. The feeling of being alone. Slowly, cautiously, the man took a step back, opening the door wider. The warmth of the cabin spilled out into the cold, creating a fragile bridge between two worlds. The wolf didn't move at first. It simply blinked at him, its body trembling. It was as if it couldn't believe what was happening, as if it didn't trust the kindness being offered to it. The man understood that feeling well. Trust was not something easily given. Not in the wild, not in life. But then, with a weak, almost hesitant motion, the wolf took a step forward. Its paws, frozen and bloodied from the ice, touched the wooden floor of the cabin. It flinched slightly, unused to the unfamiliar surface beneath it. But it did not stop. Another step, then another, and just like that, the wolf crossed the threshold. The man shut the door behind him, sealing out the storm that had nearly taken the creature's life. The cabin was small, but to the wolf, it must have felt like an entirely different world. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning wood, of warmth, of safety. It stood there, unsure, its muscles tight, its body ready to flee if needed. But the man did not move toward it. He did not try to touch it, did not try to force it to stay. Instead, he did what he knew best. He gave it space. Slowly, he moved toward the fireplace, grabbing an old, thick blanket from a wooden chair and placing it on the floor. Then, without a word, he stepped back, retreating to the other side of the room, giving the wolf the choice to decide what happened next. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wolf remained standing, its legs trembling, its body swaying with exhaustion. Then, finally, with a low, defeated sigh, it collapsed onto the blanket. It did not growl. It did not bare its fangs. It did not run. It simply let go. The man exhaled, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat down in his chair by the fire, watching the wolf, watching the slow rise and fall of its chest. He had expected it to fight, to resist, to act like the wild creature it was. But instead, it simply lay there, breathing, existing, allowing itself to feel warmth again. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind screaming against the wooden walls. But inside, for the first time in a long time, there was something else. Something different, something neither man nor beast had felt in far too long. Morning arrived like a whispered secret, soft and slow, slipping through the cracks in the wooden cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world frozen in time. Snow-covered trees standing like silent sentinels, the wind no longer howling in anger but sighing in quiet exhaustion. The man sat in his chair, staring at the fading embers of the fire, his body still but his mind restless. He had barely slept. Every so often, his eyes had drifted toward the wolf, watching its chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm, proof that it had survived the night. There had been moments when he wondered if it would wake at all, if the cold and hunger had already taken too much from it. But now, as the soft light of morning stretched across the room, the wolf stirred. A slow, deep breath, a slight twitch of an ear, and then, those golden eyes, wary, unreadable, yet no longer dull with exhaustion, opened. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Man and beast, two creatures who should never have met like this, bound together by nothing but a moment in time. The wolf's muscles tensed, its instincts flickering back to life, reminding it that it was still a creature of the wild. It pushed itself up, testing the strength in its legs, feeling the warmth that had seeped back into its bones. The man didn't speak, he simply watched. He knew this moment would come. It had to. A wolf did not belong inside walls. No matter what had happened between them, no matter the fragile understanding that had formed, the wild could not be tamed. The wolf's place was out there, in the vast expanse of the world, where the wind whispered through the trees and the stars stretched endlessly above. And yet, something inside him tightened at the thought of watching it leave. The wolf stepped forward, slow, deliberate. It was stronger now, but there was still a hesitance in its movements, as if it, too, felt the weight of the unspoken farewell. It reached the door and paused, its nose lifting slightly as it breathed in the cold scent of the outside world. The man stood, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He knew what he had to do. He walked past the wolf, his hand grazing the door handle. For a split second, he hesitated. A part of him, one he hadn't acknowledged in years, wanted to leave it shut. Wanted to keep the warmth, the presence, the company. But that wasn't how life worked. With a slow exhale, he pulled the door open. The world outside was breathtaking. The storm had left everything covered in a thick, glistening sheet of white, untouched and pure. The wolf stepped forward, paws sinking slightly into the fresh snow. It stood there staring into the distance, the vast wilderness calling it home. The man waited, watching, his heart heavy in a way he couldn't explain. Then, just as he thought it was over, just as he prepared himself for the empty silence that would follow, the wolf did something he did not expect. It turned back, not for long, not with hesitation, but with something deeper, something raw. Their eyes met one last time, man and beast, no longer strangers, no longer just two lost souls crossing paths. There was no growl, no sound, no need for words, but in that final glance, the man understood gratitude, not just for the warmth, not just for the shelter, but for something neither of them had realized. They needed a connection, a reminder that in this vast, unforgiving world, neither of them had truly been alone. And then, with the quiet dignity of a creature born of the wild, the wolf turned away and vanished into the endless white. The man stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the place where the wolf had disappeared, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The cabin felt emptier now. The fire had burned low. But something inside him had changed. He had spent years believing he needed no one, that solitude was his only companion. But last night had proven something he had long tried to forget. Even the strongest creatures, man or beast, sometimes needed warmth. Sometimes needed a moment of understanding. And sometimes, if only for a night, even a wolf could find a home. The man stood in the doorway long after the wolf had disappeared, his breath curling into the frigid air. The silence outside was different now, not empty, but full of something unspoken. He had spent years in this wilderness, surrounded by nothing but the whispering trees and the howling winds, yet this was the first time he truly felt what it meant to be alone. His fingers tightened around the doorframe before he finally exhaled and stepped back inside. The fire had burned down to a faint glow, the warmth lingering but fading fast. He tossed another log into the hearth, watching the flames lick hungrily at the wood. But no matter how fiercely it burned, it couldn't chase away the cold that had settled inside him. Days passed, but the man found himself looking out toward the tree line more often than he cared to admit. Each morning, as he stepped outside, his eyes traced the snowy expanse, searching for tracks, for any sign that the wolf had returned. He told himself it was foolish. Wolves belonged to the wild, not to men. Yet something in him still hoped. The memory of golden eyes meeting his, the quiet understanding they had shared, lingered like a shadow in his mind. He had once believed that solitude was his greatest ally, but now it felt more like a ghost that refused to leave him in peace. Then one night, as the wind rattled the wooden walls of his cabin, he heard it, the distant haunting howl of a wolf. His breath caught. It wasn't just any howl, it was close, familiar. He grabbed his coat, stepping Out onto the porch, the icy wind biting at his skin, the forest stretched before him, endless and dark, but then movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. His heart pounded as he saw it, the wolf standing just at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible against the snow. It didn't he move closer, didn't he try to cross the invisible line between their worlds. It simply stood there watching, a silent acknowledgement, a reminder that their paths had crossed and that perhaps they always would. The man took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the frost. He didn't speak, there was no need for words. The wolf tilted its head slightly as if reading something unspoken in the man's gaze, then just as quietly as it had appeared it turned and slipped back into the forest. But this time the man did not feel the ache of loneliness as sharply as before, because he knew, out there, beyond the trees, in the heart of the wild, the wolf still roamed. And though their worlds were different, they were no longer strangers. As the wind howled through the night, carrying the echoes of the wolf's song, the man returned to his cabin. He closed the door behind him, but for the first time in years, the walls did not feel like a cage. The fire burned warm, the shadows no longer loomed so large. He had thought he had given the wolf shelter that night, but perhaps, in some unspoken way, it had given him something far greater. A reminder that even in the loneliest of winters, connection could find a way. And sometimes, just sometimes, even a man lost in the cold could find his way home. The days passed slowly, each one stretching like an endless road of ice and silence. The man tried to return to his usual routine, chopping wood, mending tools, staring into the fire for hours without a word. But something had changed. The loneliness, once a familiar companion, now felt unbearable. He had spent years convincing himself that solitude was a choice, a way to escape the world that had once wounded him. Now, he wasn't so sure. Every evening, he would step outside, staring toward the tree line, waiting for something he couldn't name. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and the wind howled through the pines like a voice calling to him. And then, one night, it happened again. A pair of golden eyes gleamed in the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight. The wolf had returned. It did not approach, nor did it flee. It simply stood there, watching. The man felt a strange sense of relief. He wanted to call out, to invite the creature closer, but he knew better. Wolves did not belong in houses, just as men did not belong in the wild. Yet, somehow, they had found each other in the space between. That night, he left the door open a little longer than usual. In the morning, he noticed fresh paw prints in the snow, closer than before. As the weeks passed, a silent ritual took shape. The wolf would return, lingering just beyond the clearing, sometimes in the deep of night, sometimes in the early dawn. The man would sit on his porch, drinking his bitter coffee, pretending not to wait. Sometimes, he would speak, not expecting a response, just letting words fill the emptiness. "You remind me of someone," he murmured one night, staring at the wolf's shadowy figure. "Someone I lost a long time ago." The wolf, of course, said nothing. But it didn't leave, either. Winter deepened, and the storms grew fiercer. The man saw fewer tracks from other animals. The snow piled high, making food scarce. One morning, he found the wolf limping, its fur matted with ice and blood. A snare. Some careless hunter had set traps too close to his land. The wolf growled low as the man approached, but it was weak. He moved slowly, cautiously, speaking in a voice softer than he had used in years. "Let me help you." The wolf's golden eyes met his, filled with something raw, pain, fear, trust. And then, to his astonishment, it did not run. Bringing a wild animal into his cabin was madness. But the man had long since stopped caring about what was reasonable. He cleaned the wound, wrapping the wolf's leg with careful hands. It barely struggled. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it understood that, for now, it had no choice but to trust him. For days, the wolf lay by the fire, resting. The man kept his distance at first, but little by little, he noticed changes. The wolf no longer flinched when he moved. It watched him with quiet intelligence, its ears flicking at the sound of his voice. Sometimes, when the wind howled outside, they would simply sit together in silence, two creatures of the cold, bound by something neither could explain. As the wolf healed, the man knew what was coming. It couldn't stay. It didn't belong in a cabin any more than he belonged in a city. And yet, the thought of it leaving sent a sharp ache through his chest. The morning the wolf was strong enough to walk again, the man left the door open. He didn't watch as it padded toward the threshold. He didn't want to see it go. But then, just as the wolf reached the edge of the clearing, it stopped. Slowly, deliberately, it turned. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the man knew. This wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a passing moment in his lonely existence. It had meant something. The wolf let out a low, quiet sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Then, with one last look, it slipped into the trees. The man stood there long after the snow had covered its tracks. His chest ached, but this time, the loneliness did not feel as heavy. Because now, he knew, out there, somewhere in the wild, the wolf still roamed. And maybe, just maybe, on another cold winter's night, when the wind howled and the stars burned bright, they would find each other again. And sometimes, if only for a night, even a wolf could find a home.